in this episode. In our previous episode, we discussed about control dial, what are its uses, and we saw that the main use of the control dial in manual mode is to control the shutter speed of the camera. Now, anything in nature that is sensitive to something is always covered from it. For example, if you're a dentist and if you're listening to this particular episode, we consider IOP films, right? What is bulb mode? As soon as you put your camera on bulb mode, you can actually open the shutter or the curtain as long as the shutter button is pressed. That could be really long, and you can actually decide your shutter speed by pressing the button. Slow shutter speed is useful for light trails in fireworks photography. When you shoot a rocket in the sky and then burst in the sky, you use slow shutter speed to give you that light trails. If you break the thumb rule in general photography, what will happen is, if you are using a 100mm lens on your DSLR and you go down to say 1/50th of a second, which is a slower shutter speed, and you violate the thumb rule, that means you are breaking the thumb rule. Let us just say that you have set your shutter speed to 1/4000th of a second, right? But if you raise the flash, what you will be able to see is your shutter speed goes down to 1/200th of a second. You can try this at home. Actually do this when you're listening to the podcast. If you see a black band in your picture, and if you've used an external flash or sometimes even an internal flash or an inbuilt flash, and you manage to cross the flash synchronization speed somehow, that means that you have violated the FSS or the flash synchronization speed. Is it possible that you exceed the flash synchronization speed and the black band does not come? Well, in normal flashes, you'll always get a black band if you exceed the flash synchronization speed. You're listening to the Dental Photography School podcast, where I'll be sharing practical tips on clinical and general photography. I'm Dr. Mayur Davda, and I've been coaching dentists and dermatologists on clinical photography since 2013. In our previous episode, we discussed about control dial, what are its uses, and we saw that the main use of the control dial in manual mode is to control the shutter speed of the camera. We take this a step forward and try and understand what is the meaning of shutter speed and why is shutter speed important in photography. We'll also see what are the implications of shutter speed in dental photography in this particular episode. Alright, so what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is the time for which the sensor of the camera is exposed to visible light. So if you actually see the cross section of the camera, we have the camera body, right? So the light enters the camera body through the lens mount, and then we have a mirror. If you're considering a DSLR, behind the mirror you actually have something called as the shutter. You can also call it a curtain. And behind this curtain is actually the sensor, which is sensitive to visible light. Now, anything in nature that is sensitive to something is always covered from it. For example, if you're a dentist and if you're listening to this particular episode, we consider IOP films, right? So the IOP films have X-rays inside it, and the X-rays are obviously not completely open. They are covered with black paper, then they're covered with a lead foil, and ultimately they are also covered with a plastic cover, and then you place it inside the patient's mouth, and then you actually shoot the X-rays or the RVGs, and then the X-ray gets exposed, right? Similarly, the sensor of the camera is sensitive to visible light, so obviously it cannot be open. So what is it covered with? It's covered with a shutter. In other words, it's also covered with the curtain. Now, the amount of time you keep this curtain open is the shutter speed. As simple as that. Since shutter speed is talking about time, shutter speed cannot be increased or decreased. Shutter speed is fast or slow. In the sense, how longer you open the curtain is your shutter speed. So, what are the typical values of shutter speed in any particular camera? The slow shutter speed typically is around 30 seconds. Then as you keep on making the shutter speed faster, you can see faster shutter speeds like 1 by 100. You can also see 1 by 200. Then you go to 1 by 800, and it's as fast as 1 by 4000 in most of the cameras. However, in certain high-end cameras, the shutter speed can also go up to 1 by 8000 of a second. These are the minimum and the maximum values of shutter speed in any normal camera. By the way, we also spoke about what is bulb mode in our previous episode. That is also related to the shutter speed. What is bulb mode? As soon as you put your camera on bulb mode, you can actually open the shutter or the curtain as long as the shutter button is pressed. That could be really long, and you can actually decide your shutter speed by pressing the button. And how do we control the shutter speed? You guessed it right, with the help of the control dial, which is usually on the top of the camera in most of the cameras like Canon. Sometimes it's also on the back side of the camera like in Nikon. So, what is slow shutter speed used for and what is faster shutter speed used for? Let us increase the scope of this particular episode to general photography as well. I'm sure you must have seen both the examples, slow shutter speed as well as faster shutter speeds. Slow shutter speed is useful for light trails in fireworks photography. When you shoot a rocket in the sky and then burst in the sky, you use slow shutter speed to give you that light trails. We can also use light trails as in slow shutter speed to make light art forms in our photographs. Slow shutter speed is also useful for waterfalls photography or photography of water bodies wherein the water actually looks like clouds. That is actually slow shutter speed in action. So what is faster shutter speed used for? Faster shutter speed is useful to freeze the motion, which is the opposite of slow shutter speed. Slow shutter speed records blurring or light trails. However, the faster shutter speed freezes action. So why do you think faster shutter speed is useful for? The answers are very simple. Maybe you can put them in the comments below. However, I'm going to give you one example: sports photography. What are the other uses of faster shutter speeds? Please put them in the comments. So we saw examples for both slow shutter speed as well as faster shutter speed. Now, every setting in a camera has to have a thumb rule for good photography. So does shutter speed have a thumb rule? So the answer to that is yes. So what is the thumb rule? And it sounds like this. Shutter speed should be at least the inverse of the focal length that is attached to your camera. Sounds difficult, isn't it? But it's not that difficult, trust me. Let me give you an example so that you understand. The slow shutter speed that you should use if you have a 100mm lens attached to your camera would be 1 by 100th of a second and not slower than that. You should always prefer shutter speeds which are faster than 1 by 100th of a second. This rule is applicable for general photography and it does not necessarily hold true for flash photography. Let me give you another example. If you are using a 400mm lens on your DSLR or mirrorless camera, the slowest shutter speed should be at least 1 by 400th of a second. Yes, all these numbers are fractions. 1 by 100 is 1 by 100th of a second. 1 by 200 is 1 by 200th of a second. Similarly, 1 by 400 is 1 by 400th of a second. When you see number 30 on the shutter speed, it means 30 seconds. It's represented by 30 and 2 dashes on the right hand side at 1 o'clock position. That's 30 seconds. Now coming back to my example or the thumb rule, if you are attaching a 400mm lens on the camera, your shutter speed should be at least 1 by 400th of a second, right? Now let me ask you another question. That's question 2 of this particular episode, and if you know the answer, do put it in the comment below. What should be your shutter speed at least if you have attached a 600mm lens on your DSLR for bird photography? Please put it in the comments below if you know the answer. You can also try if you think you have a vague idea about what should be the shutter speed. I'm sure this is going to be very helpful for everyone. Since we are talking about slow shutter speed and faster shutter speed, what will happen if we break the thumb rule in general photography? If you break the thumb rule in general photography, what will happen is, if you're using a 100mm lens on your DSLR and you go down to say 1 by 50th of a second, which is a slow shutter speed, and it violates the thumb rule, that means you're breaking the thumb rule. Then you should ideally have a tripod so that you can reduce the blurring, or you should have image stabilization on your lens. Please remember once again that this is applicable to non-flash photography only, and it does not necessarily hold true for flash photography, right? Now we come to what are the implications of shutter speed in dental photography. I hope everybody knows that dental photography is equal to flash photography. So shutter speed does not really play a major role in dental photography, and we also encounter something very different when we raise the flash. Let me give you an example so that you can understand what I'm going to talk about a little better. Let us just say that you have set your shutter speed to 1/4000 of a second, right? But if you raise the flash, what you will be able to see is your shutter speed goes down to 1/200 of a second. You can try this at home. Actually do this when you're listening to the podcast. Just put your camera on manual mode, put your camera on, and put your shutter speed on 1/4000 of a second. You don't even need to attach your lens for this particular exercise. After setting your shutter speed to 1/4000 of a second, just raise the flash. You will be able to see that your shutter speed has gone down to 1/200 of a second. What is this going on? This is actually called as flash synchronization speed, or FSS. What is the meaning of FSS? It means that the fastest shutter speed that you can use when your flash is on is called as the flash sync speed, or the flash synchronization speed. Is it different for different cameras? Well, not really. In most of the cameras, it's 1/200 of a second. However, in some high-end cameras, it could be 1/250th of a second as well. However, in some cameras, it could also be 1/100th of a second. Does it really matter? Not really. It does not really matter in dental photography at all. Okay. So whatever is your flash synchronization speed, you can set it on that and do dental photography. Now, what will happen if you exceed somehow the flash synchronization speed? Let me give you an example for this as well. Let's just say that your flash synchronization speed was 1/200th of a second. When you actually use a studio light, sometimes you can cross 1/200th of a second and you can go to a higher shutter speed as well. For example, 1/300th of a second or 1/320th of a second. Sometimes, if you take a picture at 1/320th of a second, however, your flash synchronization speed was 1/200th of a second, you will be able to see a black band in your picture. That means if you see a black band in your picture and if you have used an external flash or sometimes even an internal flash or an inbuilt flash and you manage to cross the flash synchronization speed somehow, that means that you have violated the FSS, or the flash synchronization speed. As soon as you see a black band in your picture, just check your shutter speed once. There is a high possibility that you might have crossed the flash synchronization speed. So just get your shutter speed back to the FSS, or the flash synchronization speed, and the black band will go away. Is it possible that you exceed the flash synchronization speed and the black band does not come? Well, in normal flashes, you'll always get a black band if you exceed the flash synchronization speed. But we have special flashes which allow us to use our camera on faster shutter speeds even if we attach the external flash onto them. These special flashes are called high sync speed flashes. If you use these flashes on your camera, you can still go as fast as 1/4000th of a second or sometimes even 1/8000th of a second if your camera is capable of it. So that was high sync speed flashes. Typically, they are a little bit more expensive than the normal external flashes. Now coming to the last point, is FSS going to come if you're using external flash or internal flash? You will be encountering FSS irrespective if you are using inbuilt flash or internal flash, or even if you connect a ring flash or a twin flash onto your system. It is a phenomenon that you cannot ignore unless you buy a high sync speed flash. Do we have HSS ring flashes and twin flashes? Well, not yet. But you do have HSS speed lights if you want to use that. But do we really need to invest on HSS flashes? The answer to that is no. We don't really need HSS flashes for dental photography as of now. You might use it for creative purposes if you have a great creative idea in your mind. But for general dental photography, you don't really need HSS flashes. Now coming to the implication of shutter speed. So how does shutter speed affect our images? Shutter speed controls two things. One is the image exposure and the second is the amount of blurring. If your shutter speed is slow, more light will pass through the curtains and hit the sensor and the image could be brighter as compared to a faster shutter speed wherein the curtains will close faster and less amount of light will hit the sensor, in which case the image will be darker. Just remember this, slower the shutter speed, more light will enter and image will be brighter. Faster shutter speed, less light will enter and the image could be darker. Now coming to blurring. Blurring is a relative thing, obviously. If the object is moving fast and the shutter speed is fast, the image will be frozen. But if the object is moving fast and your shutter speed is slow, that means the object will be recorded as blurred. Obviously, if your shutter speed is slow and the object is not moving at all, there wouldn't be any blurring if your camera also is stable. But just to generalize, slow shutter speed have a tendency to record blurring and faster shutter speed gives you crisp, sharp pictures. In dental photography, what should be the shutter speed? In dental photography, we set the shutter speed based on the thumb rule. So if you have a 100mm lens attached to your camera, just keep a shutter speed faster than 1/100. That should be enough. It does not matter what should be your shutter speed very actually. It does not really matter what should be your shutter speed. In dental photography, just keep it in the range of 1/100 to 1/200 and that's just enough. For general photography, your image exposures will change. Most probably for dental photography, your image exposure won't change if you move from 1/100th of a second to 1/200th of a second. Maybe you should try this exercise at home. Go close to your window and select a good object which is well illuminated, a pretty object which is well illuminated. Keep your ISO constant, say ISO 800 or say ISO 1600. Keep your f at f5.6. Take 3 or 4 pictures at different shutter speeds. Say one image at 1/10, one image at 1/100, one image at 1/2000 and one image at 1/4000. See what is the difference that's actually taking place. And you will be able to understand shutter speed way more better by yourself. That's all for this episode. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. That's all we have time for in this episode. If you are getting benefited from my tips, do show your love by leaving a rating and a review. For tutorials on photography, do check out my channel Dental Photography School on YouTube. To participate in contests and live events, join the Dental Photography School Facebook and Telegram group. You can follow me on Instagram as Mayur_EOS Maestro or Dental Photography School. I'll meet you next week. Till then, keep listening, keep sharing.